Okay, let's wrap up chapter 4. I want to talk a little bit about some interesting groups of prokaryotes, some of which actually we talked about in lab recently. Actually, our very first lab, we looked at some living specimens that included this particular group of non-pathogenic bacteria that were photosynthetic or are photosynthetic. Now, you remember from high school that photosynthesis is the process whereby an organism like a plant, or in this case, certain types of bacteria, are utilizing the sun's energy along with special photosynthetic pigments to convert that sunshine into energy that the cell can use to make organic molecules. Another thing that photosynthetic organisms do, in addition to making organic compounds, is they can take CO2 from the air or from the water, and from that use that to help produce the carbon-based proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. But the other thing that photosynthetic organisms do is they produce oxygen gas. They actually split the water. So we benefit directly from photosynthesis, don't we, as air-breathing animals? So we want to talk about a particularly interesting group of photosynthetic bacteria. And of course, I'm talking specifically here about the cyanobacteria. These particular prokaryotes, as it mentions here, date back a long, long time ago. You recall that prokaryotes first were found to exist on Earth 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. And at that time, the atmosphere of the Earth was very anaerobic. There was no oxygen to speak of in our atmosphere. But as the cyanobacteria began to appear, as it mentions there, 3 billion years ago, a very important process that we call photosynthesis began to occur within these cells. So as a result, as I mentioned a few moments ago, one end product of photosynthesis is the production of oxygen gas. So it was the slow but gradual production of oxygen by the cyanobacteria some 3 billion years ago that eventually charged our atmosphere with oxygen. And that paved the way for the evolution of eukaryotic cells, of which you are consisting of several trillion of those eukaryotic cells. So we can, in some weird way, thank those cyanobacteria for us being around today. They led to the evolution of eukaryotes. And so we still have some descendants of those ancient cyanobacteria that still live on Earth today. And all you got to do really is go to a pond or a freshwater lake in the summertime, around here even, and you can find these cyanobacteria. They look, if you recall from lab, they look very much like green algae. A lot of them, at least the freshwater forms, are very filamentous. They're green because they have the chlorophyll, remember, that they're using to photosynthesize with. And most people, 99% of people, if you were to look at this under the microscope, if you know anything about biology, you'd probably initially say, I'm looking at green algae. But there are some traits, some structures that you sometimes look for, like heterocysts, that would make you perhaps question that initial diagnosis, if you will. The fact is, you have cyanobacteria that you're looking at under the microscope. But they don't live strictly in the water on the edge of a lake or pond. You can find them in the oceans. They've been, again, present on Earth for many, many billions of years. And they take on a variety of shapes and colors even. And you see some of that here on this slide. But remember, they all possess these disc-like plates called thylakoids, and it's in the thylakoid that the chlorophyll pigments exist. The other fascinating thing about cyanobacteria is that these prokaryotic cells have inclusions in them. Remember us talking about inclusions not too long ago in chapter 4, that contain gas, specifically CO2, that helps to pull that filamentous cyanobacteria perhaps toward the surface of the water, closer to where the sun can penetrate, closer to where we can have optimal photosynthesis. I think that's pretty interesting. This particular hyperlink that says stromatolite here, I'd like you to watch that video. It talks more about cyanobacteria and the structures called stromatolites. And here you're looking at a section through one of these structures. And what you're in essence seeing here are layers, sort of like layers of a tree, right? This represents layers of cyanobacteria that once lived, but they got sort of replaced with the next layer of cyanobacteria. So the oldest of the cyanobacteria in this particular stromatolite, which can be, the size of a, you'll see some photographs and some video when you click on that hyperlink. Some of these stromatolites can be quite large in size, like several feet across. So the living cells, the cyanobacteria, would be on the very periphery here of this stromatolite, and this would represent many, 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 many thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years of slow but steady accumulation, if you will, of layering, all representing past generations of cyanobacteria. So pretty neat stuff. Your book then begins to talk about some really interesting medically significant prokaryotes there that I'm not going to spend time lecturing on. You can, I think, just kind of look over this section of the book. I have expanded upon that in these next few slides, where I talk about the rickettsias, they're called. They're really, really tiny gram-negative bacteria that are obligate intracellular pathogens. What does that mean? Well, intracellular means that this particular prokaryote has to get into the cell, into the host cell of an organism. And typically, we're talking about a eukaryotic organism of some sort, or made up of eukaryotic cells. Obligate means in order to complete their life cycle, they must get into the cell. And there they cause major issues. And so, again, I would ask you just to look over this slide as well as the section in the book, short little paragraph on ricketsias. There are different kinds of ricketsias. I mentioned one here called Rickettsia typhi that is passed on often by mice or rodents. So check that out. And another rickettsia that causes what's called epidemic typhus. You might notice from these 3 slides, these rickettsia intracellular parasites often make use of a vector, it's called. In this case, you see it says body louse, and there's a photograph of a body louse. In order to be passed on, if you will, to the final host, which would be a human potentially, the body louse would bite you, and you would be infected with the rickettsia bacterium. And you can read all about what will happen to you if that were to happen. The chlamydias, also another obligate intracellular parasite, very, very small, bacillus-shaped, pleomorphic prokaryote. The difference between chlamydias and ricketsias, as it mentions here, is you don't need an arthropod like a louse or a tick to get that parasite, if you will, that bacterium carried to you. This is actually often transmitted as a result of sexual intercourse. And so again, you can check this out. There's an interesting CDC page there that talks more about chlamydias. Really interesting. Small, unusual, medically significant bacteria. I want to finish up the chapter and talk about this domain, the Archaea. You've heard it before. You've also heard me mention one of the earlier slides when we were looking at the taxonomy, figure 4.27, that gave a sense of the classification scheme based on ribosomal analysis, that the Archaea domain and the Eukarya domain share more common evolutionary and ribosomal connection, if you will, than does Archaea share commonality to bacteria. And this is kind of interesting because we know that bacteria and Archaea contain prokaryotic cells. So logic would say that because they both are made up of prokaryotes, they should be more closely related. Well, the reality is that even though Archaeans are prokaryotic cells, they share, in many respects, more similarity with eukaryotic cells than they do with organisms in the domain bacteria. And a lot of that boils down to analysis of the ribosome. Now, you remember from earlier in the chapter, the ribosome is the organelle where proteins are assembled. And I talked about the two sites there where the transfer RNAs fit in, if you recall. And we described the fact that we have those two subunits, the large and small subunits, which when put together form a fully functional ribosome. Well, it turns out that when you look at the ribosome of Archaea cells, and as well as comparing it with cells in the Eukarya domain, that there is similarity between the two with respect to ribosome structure. So that leads us to believe that there may be some evolutionary connectiveness, if you will, between these two domains. The fact that there is no peptidoglycan in the cell walls of Archaeans, and we know there's none in Eukarya cells, but there's lots in the domain bacteria, those cells. So it's kind of an interesting comparison. When you think of Archaea, you think of cells, you should think of cells that live in very, very inhospitable extreme environments. At least if you were to go to look for them on Earth today, you'd have to go, as we will travel together as a group in just a moment, to Yellowstone, to the geysers and the bubbling hot pot areas there. So I think the term extremophile does a good job describing Archaeans. They live in extreme environments. And as it mentions here, sometimes they are hyper-extremophiles, as you'll see in just a moment. But that kind of makes sense because these Archaeans like it hot. They like it very acidic. They like it very salty. So we use terms like thermophilic to describe heat-loving. We use the term halophilic when we talk about salt-loving. And this aerial photograph is showing a bunch of fields filled with salt. This is taken out west, I think. And you can see from the colors, the beautiful reds and oranges and pinks and various degrees of those shades are depicting the Archaeans that are loving these very salty pools. This hyperlink, which I want you to watch, this 3-minute video, talks about Archaea that live in very deep ocean vent communities. These were discovered in the 1970s by small 2-man submersible submarines found in deep trench regions of almost all of the oceans of the world today. They were first discovered, I think, in the Pacific, but they've since discovered them all throughout the world's oceans. But they're very, very super deep areas of the ocean where it is extremely inhospitable. The pressure is very, very high. It's very, very cold. However, there are these hydrothermal vent communities that are there in these deep ocean trenches. And the video will talk about that, but I'll simply say that the base of the food chain within these deep ocean vent communities are the Archaeans, these extremophilic prokaryotic cells. And it's this ecological base that supports other organisms, including many fascinating eukaryotic organisms, as you'll see in the video. Big 3-foot-long tube worms, blind shrimp and crabs, and just all sorts of fascinating creatures. And these Archaea are getting their energy from the earth, because these smokers, as you'll see in the video, are developed from the hot magma in the Earth's mantle that eventually works its way toward the surface. And you see these smokers, and it's describing the gases given off and various chemicals, some of which again are being utilized by the Archaea. That's where they're getting their energy from. It's astounding. And it's from those Archaeans, as I said a moment ago, that other trophic levels, if you will, other layers within the entire ecosystem are supported. Very, very, very inhospitable. Scientists were totally shocked to find any life there, much less the diversity of unique organisms. But we can thank the Archaea for providing the basis for these fascinating ecosystems. Some Archaea are methanogens, meaning they produce methane gas. Now, these aren't the only cells that produce methane, but I've showed you in this particular slide a couple different photographs, including some termite mounds in Africa. You can see how tall these are. Now, these are made by blind termites, about the size of an ant. They're very, very, very small, but they have a very complex social biology, very interesting. But these termites possess in their stomachs, in their gut, methanogens, some of which are protozoans and others are prokaryotic cells, which would be likely Archaea of some sort. And what these cells do is they are able to utilize the cellulose in the wood, because we typically associate termites with crumbling wooden structures, don't we? Well, there's no crumbling structures here, but these insects are gathering the grasses and the twigs and so forth, and they're utilizing that, and they're producing these amazing structures, these colonies. But one end product of the metabolism of the cellulose is the production of methane gas. CH4 is the chemical formula. And here we have a Holstein cow chewing some grass from a pasture. Holsteins and other ruminants also harbor in their gut, they have actually 4 chambers to their stomach, one of which is called the rumen. So you may have heard the term ruminant, which is an animal that chews its cud. So cows are ruminants, deer are ruminants. And so what they're doing is they're ingesting this cellulose, which is in the grass and in the hay and the straw. And the symbiotic microorganisms that live in its rumen, symbiotic meaning both are benefiting, right? The protozoa or the bacteria, the Archaea are benefiting because they have a nice warm place to live. And what the cow is benefiting, because what it will do is it will take the sugars produced as a result of that degradation of the cellulose by the microorganisms. The cow will absorb the sugar. Yeah, it'll absorb glucose and other mono and disaccharides. If it didn't have the microorganisms in its rumen, the cow could never derive any nutrition from the grass and silage that it's eating. So it's a fascinating biology. This photograph is showing, and before I go to there, let me just mention, cows actually also produce copious amounts of methane. And remember, again, it's not the cow itself that produces it, although it is the cow. It's the microorganisms in the rumen that produce the methane. And what the cow does is it actually belches methane, believe it or not. Look it up if you don't believe me. So termites are big methane producers, so are cows. They contribute to climate change by producing the methane, which acts as a gas that, greenhouse gas is really what it is. You all heard of greenhouse gases. And what the greenhouse gas does is it sort of provides a blanket, if you will, over our atmosphere. So the heat is trapped inside rather than having a lot of heat exit through our atmosphere. This blanket of greenhouse gas, like methane, keeps our planet warmer than it ordinarily would be. This is methane being produced at a landfill. And so this funny looking structure here is stuck into the landfill, and the methanogens that live in the garbage, basically, they're metabolizing the organic material here. It's slowly siphoned off into the atmosphere. This is contributing to global warming too. So it's kind of sad, but true. We mentioned a few moments ago that Archaea love to live in extreme environments. Some like it salty, some like it hot, some like it cold. Most of the time hot. I'd say more hot than cold probably. But a good place to go to find them, if you ever get a chance, is to travel out west to Yellowstone National Park. This is, I believe, our oldest national park. I've been there several times, and it is a place, if you go, try to spend at least a week there, because there's so much to see. You know, elk and wolves, it's a lot of wildlife. Even in the wintertime, Yellowstone is a beautiful place. It's really cold there. So the best time to go would be the summertime. But they have various walkways, as you can see here, that extend out into these geyser areas. And it's one of the most active regions on Earth in terms of geysers and mud pots and other sorts of geothermal areas. Now, the beautiful colors that you're seeing here, the blue, a little tinge of green, perhaps, these are Archaea that are living in these very hot geyser pool areas. And so I took a photograph here that talk a little bit more about not just all Archaea. There, as you see here, there are thermophilic algae. So there's some eukaryotes that live in pretty inhospitable places too. But the vast majority of the orange and red that you see, and some green, are due to these thermophilic Archaea. Very, very interesting place to visit. Probably the most famous, one of the most famous areas in the park is Grand Prismatic Spring. This is a very, very large spring. This is obviously an aerial view. You can see the walkway here in the lower part of the photograph. These are people walking along. And literally, there are not guardrails here. They assume people are smart enough not to go walking off into the Grand Prismatic Spring, because it's like really, really hot, and you smell this rotten egg odor. If the wind's blowing in the right direction, you can definitely smell the hydrogen sulfide, which is being produced by those microbes. This is very, very deep, deeper than a 10-story building, believe it or not, but gorgeous colors. You can see the orange of the Archaea transitioning into a yellow and then a green. So the blue is probably simply a reflection of the sunlight, but very, very deep, very, very large, very interesting place to go and visit. Well, about 5, 6, 7 years ago, there was an individual who got a little too close to one of these hot thermal spring areas and actually slipped in and died. And so you can check out this slide. Very, very sad. But as I said a few moments ago, these walkways, you can go off the walkway if you want to do that. They of course warn you not to do that for obvious reasons, because accidents can happen. It's amazing more people don't die, but the water temperature here is extremely hot. If you fell in, you'd never be able to get out. Very, very interesting, but dangerous place if you're not careful. Even the residents of Yellowstone, like these bison, have to be careful. Now, in the middle of the winter, you heard me mention earlier that this is a very inhospitable place. Temperatures can get to 40 below zero. They get a lot of snow. And so the bison naturally migrate to these warmer hydrothermal areas because of the temperature being so much nicer. There's not much food for them there, but at least it's warmer. And they found that bison actually can sometimes become can get overcome by the toxic chemicals given off by these geysers, and that's what they talk about there in that little box. This is a picture that I took, so you can see that they do frequent the edges, and perhaps several have fallen in over the years too. I don't know. Okay, that wraps up chapter 4 on survey of the prokaryotic cells.